And welcome to our live stream here with Atlanta News First Plus. I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe with Atlanta News First Investigates, and we are continuing our coverage of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Tonight is a big night. We will get into that in just a moment because the man of the hour, Donald Trump, will accept officially the nomination of the Republican Party for the second time to try to win the White House again with an intervening term from Joe Biden. That's the goal of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And tonight we can expect that speech, and it comes just days after an attempted assassination of the former president. But we want to start with what happened already last night. Last night was a big night at the Republican National Convention. JD Vance, you can see him there pumping his fist. Senator from Ohio, freshman senator, is the nominee for vice president. Donald Trump's running mate announced just a few days ago. And what he did was he talked about his book there, Hillbilly Elegy. That was sort of what launched him into the public zeitgeist nationally, because it was about his troubled childhood, growing up poor in Ohio. And it was controversial to a certain extent, but it was really the story of his own rise from having a mother who was suffering from addiction, a father who abandoned him, being raised by his grandparents, overcoming all those challenges to become a U.S. Marine, where it galvanized his belief in patriotism and his service to the United States of America. And then he became a venture capitalist in addition to writing that best-selling book, and then ascends to the Senate. And ascending to the Senate in his political life, this is the most fascinating point to me. JD Vance, who accepted the nomination for Vice President of the United States at the Republican National Convention, that's the first convention he's ever been to in his entire life. Because think about it, in 2020, the conventions essentially were virtual. The Democrats were virtual. The Republicans were on the lawn of the White House. And then you have to go all the way back to 2016. And at that point, no one had ever even heard the name of J.D. Vance on the political front. So we have someone who's a political newcomer. And that's kind of the point, is you have a new generation. He is a veteran of the wars after September 11th. In fact, he joined the military and became a Marine because of the attacks in September 11th, 2001. And so he is the first person on any party's ticket in any position to be a veteran of the wars that followed in Afghanistan and Iraq. He is a new generation. That is what they're trying to promote. That's what they're saying. He is sort of, this is Donald Trump passing the torch, but more importantly, passing his movement on to a new generation, so that the generation, the MAGA movement, if you will extend beyond Donald Trump's term in office if he wins again, and beyond his lifetime. That's kind of the goal. But also J.D. Vance gives them something else. It gives them the Rust Belt. He's sort of an ambassador, if you will, to some very important swing states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. These are all places that are not only geographically close to where he grew up, but they're also very close demographically to where he grew up, specifically in the more rural areas that have faced challenges, blue-collar areas that have seen jobs go overseas, that have seen challenges in the economy, that have faced the opioid epidemic. These are all things that J.D. Vance is fluent in, and so he is sort of a bridge to that audience that Donald Trump needs so much. So to talk about what happened last night and where we go from here tonight, I do want to bring in Ben Taylor. Ben Taylor is a professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. Ben, it's always good to have you here and have your analysis.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
So what was first let's start with J.D. Vance last night, because there were other speakers as well. What was your perception of, one, his nomination, the selection of him by Donald Trump, but also his speech last night to the convention?
Well, I think everything you've said so far has really hit the nail on the head in terms of what he represents, in terms of where he comes from, his life story, as well as his age, his sort of general demographic position within the political spectrum of the Republican Party. But the other thing that I really think is notable about J.D. Vance being on a ticket with Donald Trump is that now the Republican Party, which for decades, or at least since the 1980s, sort of been talked about as the party of Reagan, with specific policies about pro-immigration policies in a lot of ways. You think back to the Reagan administration, Free trade was a hallmark. Sort of this idea of American power, American military power, and soft power being used around the world to spread American ideals. Much of that we've seen over the last 40 years of Republican Party policies, that is over. This is the party of Donald Trump, and it's a different party than we've seen in the last decades. And JD Vance embodies all of that. Just like Donald Trump, he's been an advocate in the U.S. Senate, though he's been there for a short time, of protectionist policies and isolationist foreign policy. And that is, in some sense, a hearkening back to a prior Republican Party of 100 years ago, but it's really a new development in our current political paradigm. And I think that's really notable, is that, Donald Trump has really captured the Republican Party in a way that in the previous two cycles he had not been able to. And I think that's what you see in the selection of JD Vance as his VP. And in terms of his speech last night, I think that, doing what vice presidential candidates should do at conventions, he did it, right? He gave a good speech, talked about himself, introduced himself to the American people. As you pointed out, he is a newcomer to the political scene. And so he gave us his life story, but he also sort of gave that attack line against President Biden and the Biden administration more broadly that you're going to see coming out from now to the end of the fall campaign with Election Day.
Yeah, isn't that something that, though, he has a little bit more credibility to make those accusations, in part because, one of the things that Joe Biden has been able to do throughout his political career is he's Joe from Scranton. Hey, I'm Joe. I'm not Joseph, I'm Joe. Right. And I'm from Scranton, and I grew up in a hard scrabble life right. In the Wilkes-Barre Scranton area. And even though I may have been a lifetime politician, I'm really Joe from Scranton.
Right.
Well, now we have JD Vance from Middletown, Ohio.
Right.
And he has the ability to sort of poke through that armor that has been political armor for Joe Biden.
That's certainly part of his appeal, JD Vance's appeal to the Trump campaign, for sure. And I think there's something to that. As you pointed out earlier, the states in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are the holy grail for whoever wins this election. They've got to win those states. And so I think that JD Vance is, I think the next trip they're going on is to Michigan here right after they leave the convention. They're going to just sort of leave JD Vance in the general Midwest, probably, because that's where his greatest appeal is, and that's where they're going to try to win those votes and sort of dent Joe Biden's greatest appeal in some sense. And that is sort of the trick for any presidential campaign, is to take your opponent's strength and make it their weakness, right? That's what really successful presidential campaigns do, and that's what this is clearly an attempt at doing. But that assumes that Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee.
Yeah, and it's no mistake they're going to Michigan, and exactly 1 week after the attempted assassination on Donald Trump. He is going to be at his first rally since that attempted assassination. But with JD Vance, and they're both going to Michigan, a lot of people who don't understand Michigan, I worked there as a reporter for a couple of years, and I can tell you that, it's not, we tend to think of Detroit, and we tend to think of it as a swing state. It's really not a purple state as much as very, very blue areas and very, very red areas.
Right.
I mean, remember, Gerald Ford was from Grand Rapids, and that part of West Michigan, Northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, these are, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans who are, and I guess the idea is to try to get them to come out on Election Day. Right. That kind of leads me to a question right now I wanted to ask you about this startling shift that we've seen in less than a month now, where we've seen the Democratic Party that was unified, organized, we're all behind Joe Biden. He had no real challenger in the primaries. We're organized. Not only are we organized, we're going to nominate Joe early, even before the convention, with a virtual roll call vote. Right. That was a month ago. Then we had that disastrous debate performance, and then calls for him to be replaced at the top of the ticket. The Democrats now in disarray, where you have Joe Biden saying, no, I'm staying in it, and now getting COVID yesterday. And then in addition, you have people at the very top of the Democratic Party questioning and even encouraging him to step down. On the other side, you had the Republican Party, which was fractured. You had sort of the Nikki Haley camp. She wasn't even invited to the convention. Yeah. All of this changes, of course, last Saturday with the attempted assassination on Donald Trump, that iconic photograph of him fist pumping in the air, almost sure to win the Pulitzer, narrowly survives, literally by inches or millimeters, an attempt on his life with a shot from a would-be assassin. And then you have this call for unity. And the unity isn't between the Democrats and the Republicans. The unity is within the Republican Party. Nikki Haley's invited. She's given a prime speaking role. She gives a full-throated endorsement. Everyone is lining up, even, not last night, the night before. All of Donald Trump's former competitors for the nomination all came forward and gave him full-throated endorsements. So I guess to sum it up, you have the Democratic Party, which is now in disarray and not organized and not reading from the same hymnal, and you have the Republicans that are now not only organized, but are organized at just the right moment so that they have a 4-night infomercial saying, hey, we're the future, these other guys are the past.
That's exactly right. And if you're the Republican Party, if you're the RNC organization proper or the Trump campaign, you couldn't have hoped for a better, so far, a better convention. The entire purpose of these political conventions in the 21st century is, well, as you sort of point out, they're 4-day pep rallies. They're supposed to energize the troops, galvanize the troops, the folks who are going to knock on doors and canvass in the fall and do get out the vote campaigns and things of that nature. And they're supposed to direct attention on how great the nominee is and how bad your opponent is. And the Republican convention this year, this is the third time that the Trump campaign has been in charge of the RNC, right? And I have to say that based on the previous two, this one has gone to plan in ways the previous two did not. So in that sense, I guess third time is the charm for them. But they couldn't have asked for a better situation on the other side with, as you point out, the Democrats being somewhat unsure about what's happening at the top of their ticket. And I really have to point out that one of the things that is a kryptonite to any presidential campaign or political party in a big election cycle is uncertainty. And that there is any uncertainty at all in who will be the Democratic nominee. For all intents and purposes, it will be President Biden. But that there is even a non-zero chance that it would not be introduces a level of uncertainty that we have simply not seen at this level of American politics in decades, and we do not know how it will play out, assuming that President Biden decides to not run, if that is his decision. And it will have to be his because there's really no other mechanism for the Democrats to change nominees at this point. And so it is an interesting role reversal, but one that as soon as the Democratic Party and the Biden campaign comes up with a plan and everyone coalesces around that plan, if we assume that President Biden, if he's the nominee, can do the things we expect major presidential nominees to do, then we'll see this sort of reversion back to the mean, where you'll have partisans come home. It'll be a very close election, and we'll see what happens in swing states where JD Vance could make a big difference. But if the Democrats are not able to coalesce, if there's still uncertainty 2 weeks from now running into their convention, that's a very different scenario. And again, one that we've really never seen before. And so it will be a real empirical question for everyone watching about how that plays out as we move into the election season itself.
That is such a sharp analysis, Ben, where you're saying it's not whether Joe Biden is at the top of the ticket or not. It's the uncertainty itself.
That's correct.
That is potentially fatal to the Democrats' attempts to hold on to not just the White House, but the House of or hold on to the Senate and try to get the House of Representatives. It also fascinates me. Yesterday, Peter Navarro showed up, literally gets out of federal prison, and puts on a suit and makeup and gets on the stage at the RNC in Milwaukee. I mean, he started the day in prison and ended the day on the dais in Milwaukee. And normally, I mean, talk about how times have changed.
Yeah.
He would be, persona non grata. Hey, maybe we don't want to accentuate this. No, he turned it around into this like badge of honor that, the weaponized Department of Justice, his words, not mine, came after me. And not only that, he said all three branches came after me, basically, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive, and essentially falsely imprisoned him. And I'm here because I didn't give up on Donald Trump, and he's not going to give up on you. What's interesting is they've very successfully, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, they very successfully turned these prosecutions and these indictments into political positives rather than something to be ashamed of.
Well, I don't know if they've successfully done it or not, but what I will say is that what you would expect from the opposition. So if the Republicans are doing this, Peter Navarro is a strong supporter of President Trump, Republican. The The alternative to that is that the Democratic nominee or the Democratic Party, the campaign of that party's nominee, has to make the case about why these were not political, and that this is the ongoing this is the day-to-day happenings of justice going on, and this wasn't political in a sense. And Peter Navarro was convicted of obstruction of Congress, I believe, and things.
That's right. Well, it was basically, he refused to testify.
Right.
He said it was executive privilege, even though the privilege hadn't been asserted.
Right.
It was a jury trial.
Exactly.
But he's saying it was this sort of, D.C. swamp jury.
And this goes back to my previous comments about the uncertainty. The problem that the Democratic Party is having right now, the problem the Biden campaign is having, is that all of the news about them is about Joe Biden and his physical capacity to be the nominee, and and his current illnesses and things like that. That kind of attention is every second that the attention is on President Biden is the second that cannot be devoted to making the case against Donald Trump and the Republicans, and that is what's causing the uncertainty on the Democratic side and the consternation, the reasons you keep seeing people try to say that maybe Joe Biden should step off the stage and let Vice President Harris take over, or something to that effect. And so you're right that the Republicans could have this individual come out and sort of defiantly say that it was a political prosecution, and they've been saying this routinely about Donald Trump's own legal problems, many of which are actually not even at the federal level. But again, the Democrats have not been able to effectively make that case and sort of explain in a very matter-of-fact way about, well, what are we actually talking about? And that's what's causing the problems on the Democratic side, creating a lot of benefits for Republicans, because as we continue down the road to November, and election day no longer exists. We have election months and weeks in some cases. The frame is being set about who the candidates are, what the election is about. And the longer the Biden campaign or the Democratic Party is not able to effectively frame the Trump campaign, then that's just going to create more trouble for them as election day, the election period gets closer.
And tonight, Donald Trump will accept his party's nomination on stage in Milwaukee. And it's always an open question, which Donald Trump is going to show up. Obviously, this was pre-written, but by his own admission, he threw out the script he had before the attempted assassination and wrote a new one. And his family members have sort of echoed that and said, no, this is a different speech. And that does lend to the question, which Donald Trump do you think will show up tonight? The bombastic, sort of speaking in hyperbole, maybe throwing in a few falsehoods, or do you think we're going to see I don't want to use the word chastened because it's been overused by the press, but someone who's been changed by a near-death experience?
Well, we honestly couldn't say which one we'll see, but I think you rightly point out the options that we have before us, right? My sense would be, having watched Donald Trump for almost a decade on the political scene and watching the speeches that he's given and sort of understanding his perspectives and what he wants to accomplish, my sense would be that it's going to be vintage Trump, because again, that's what his strongest supporters really love. But I would not be surprised, because Donald Trump is nothing if not a savvy understander, or have a savvy understanding of the media landscape. My sense would be that he would probably understand that a more chastened, toned down version of his typical speech is probably something that would play very well in the current media environment, and would probably see him gain a lot in the polls. We're always curious coming out of conventions what the bounce is in public opinion for the candidates, and so my guess would be that former President Trump is looking to get that bounce, and as big a bounce as he possibly can. So we might see a more toned down version of some of his greatest hits.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about, Donald Trump is always talking about strength, and he's always talking about his opponents in terms of weakness. These are, he's no matter what you think about Donald Trump, he is a master marketer. He's a master communicator in terms of communicating those sort of things in very clear contrast. He always gives his nicknames to his opponents, weak or sleepy or, that kind of thing. And then he always talks about himself in terms of strength. And that is sort of inside baseball and, maybe a topic for a political science class, except we now have a very visible sort of echo of that, where we had the attempted assassination on Saturday, under fire. And again, you can apply whatever motivations you want to it, but a man who had just been shot gets up and holds his fist in the air and says, fight, 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 survives an attempt on his life from a would-be assassin. And then the contrast is you have Joe Biden from the debate a few weeks ago, who clearly had trouble just being present, and then you had Joe Biden getting COVID, which is, of course, no fault of his own, but it's sort of a virus has sidelined the President of the United States, and an assassin couldn't take out his challenger. Is that a fair analysis of the way you think the electorate is seeing this?
Well, I think that the American people are paying attention to this, but I don't think, and again, this all gets sort of baked in some sense, that just sort of the day-to-day uptake of the news and information, and people watch the news and get headlines and things like that. So I'm not sure that we could take anything away from these two particular events, like in and of themselves. But I do think that you're correct in a sense that it sort of feeds this larger frame about the candidates, about their campaigns. And again, I reiterate that every single day, every second of any day that passes where the Biden campaign or any presidential campaign is not spending time defining their opponent and defining the terms of the campaign for themselves is a day that they are potentially falling behind. And so this goes back again to the Biden campaign has to explain why the president is taking time off the campaign trail because of COVID, or what is he still going to be the nominee? All of that takes time away from talking about Donald Trump, which is just another second towards Election Day that they've not made their case to the American people.
I'm going to ask you a tough question, Ben. I normally wouldn't ask you to prognosticate, and I'm not asking you to sort of put down a marker now, except to say, based on your expertise and analysis, do the Democrats have time to turn this around? Is this election, let me point out, I got texts from people on Saturday once that AP photograph came out. These were far left liberals, because I have sources who are far right, and I have sources who are far left, who sent me that photograph and said it's over. That's from people who are dyed-in-the-wool Biden supporters.
Sure.
At least they're saying that in private. Now, that's anecdotal. That's not a poll. Sure. We don't yet know how the broader Democratic electorate feels. But is there time, do you think, to where if the Democrats get their house in order, that they could actually be competitive in November and maybe even pull this out?
Competitive, absolutely. And I think there's an eternity left in this election cycle. The problem, again, is that we assume that both the Republican and Democratic nominees, when we talk about it being a close election, or it's going to be razor thin, there's like 3 swing states or what have you, that assumes that both campaigns are running top-notch canvassing operations, get out the vote operations. They're working with down-ballot candidates of their parties. They're working with state operations, and they're running a tight ship, as it were, for the campaign to be focused on those really marginal voters that are going to make a difference in some of these swing states. If one campaign does not do that, if they're not doing everything we expect a really competitive campaign to do, that's when you see margins begin to widen. And so, yes, there is plenty of time for things to happen in this election cycle. Recall, in 2016, when the Access Hollywood tape came out, the same conversations that Democrats are having about Joe Biden today, Republicans were having about Donald Trump in October of the election year. People were voting already, and the Speaker of the House said on camera by himself, not through intermediaries, Paul Ryan said, Donald Trump should not be our nominee. He should drop out. We have to move on. So, and he won, right? He pulled an ancestry. He won the right states. He lost the popular vote, but he wins the Electoral College. So yes, there's actually a great deal of opportunity, but the problem is we have to see, well, if you're a Democrat, you have to see the coalescence of the party leaders as well as the party apparatus behind the candidate, and that's simply not happening right now for Joe Biden. And the Biden campaign, Joe Biden himself, has to decide if he can actually make that happen or if he thinks he needs to pass the torch. And until that decision is official and everyone decides, well, this is what we're going to do now, you're going to see this drum and strang, this sort of wailing and gnashing of teeth behind closed doors, and perhaps not so behind closed doors in terms of leaks to the media. And that creates a lot of trouble for the Democratic Party broadly, both down ballot races as well as the presidential ticket. But to answer your question from a few minutes ago, yes, it's very possible that this is going to be a very, very competitive election. And so notwithstanding the events that have already happened, there are more events yet to come. We don't know what those are, but they're coming, most likely.
So many lessons from 2016. I was there in Cleveland for the Republican convention and in Philadelphia for the Democratic convention in 2016. But I can tell you that in Cleveland, there was this Never Trump movement, and there was actually an attempt on the floor to use the rules to, and I was there. I was like, it was during the day. It wasn't even a nighttime session, and there was this scrum. I was maybe 20 feet from it watching it, and it was the sort of last gasp of the effort to try to prevent him from being the nominee. What a difference 8 years makes.
That's right.
Where now you have this sort of unified party, but it isn't even the same party. One journalist said, I don't even recognize anyone here, a veteran journalist from one of the networks, because they were so used to covering the Republican Party of 8 years ago. There are very few faces left from that party because, as you pointed out, it's Donald Trump's party. I do want to come back to you in a moment, Ben, but first I want to go to Doug Reardon, who's actually on the floor, or at least in the arena, there in Milwaukee, and he's been following all this. And first and foremost, Doug, I want to ask you, what did you think of last night with Donald Trump Jr.? You also had Donald Trump's granddaughter sort of presenting the human side, sort of the grandpop side of Donald Trump. And then, of course, you had JD Vance and his wife speaking.
Yeah, lines about sneaking the grandkids candy and soda is really relatable for voters, I think. And so, I like to do the same thing you just mentioned, Brendan. I like to use my family and friends and sources to kind of gauge how things are going in the political sphere, just as my own little mini finger on the pulse. But, I think a lot of people felt last night was very effective. It normalized Donald Trump. He is a untouchable billionaire who has spent his life living in almost literally an ivory tower. And so I think that by doing some of these things, and we'll talk about Vance in a second because I think it's kind of the same sentiment, but by bringing his kids out, by bringing his granddaughter out to talk about what it's like, it really normalizes him as a human. It humanizes him quite effectively. And so that really was one of the bigger, I think, talked about things from last night. One of the bigger talked about speakers from last night was his 17-year-old granddaughter, who came out and kind of said, look, he's just a regular guy when he's not on TV, when he's not being that talking head that everyone is used to seeing. And so that certainly, I think, was effective. And last night's programming was really hitting emotional nerves with people here. They also brought out the families of several of the 13 soldiers, U.S. service members who were killed in Afghanistan, to talk about Biden's reaction to it and his response to it versus Trump's response to it, and the stark differences between the two men and how they reacted and reached out to these families. And so I think last night's programming really was effective. And of course, we have a really interesting lineup tonight. We have Hulk Hogan, Tucker Carlson, and of course Eric Trump. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a different night for sure. The theme here at the last day of the RNC is back to basics. It's Make America Great Again. And so I think it's going to be that really rah-rah type of night that we're more used to seeing at Trump rallies. Of course, JD Vance talked up there last night. It was kind of his first mass public words to the American people since he was given this nomination and put on the ticket with Trump. And really, it was kind of a cross between an anointment for him as the next round, the next generation of this MAGA Republican movement. He's just 39 years old, and so he will carry it on for a long time if he so chooses. But he also was really pledging a lot of fealty to Trump, someone who he has had at times a very checkered relationship with. He at one point, I know this is very well reported, called him America's Hitler. He called people who voted for him the first time around idiots. And so they seem to have buried the hatchet really quite effectively here, and now running on this ticket together pretty much in line with all of the same policies that Trump has made focal points of his campaign and his administration in the past. Immigration, talking about jobs, making other countries foot the bill for international conflicts. A lot of what we heard from Vance last night, although it was more talking points than solutions to problems, were some of the same things that we heard out of Donald Trump's mouth over the last 8-10 years while he's been in this political realm. And so, I think if people want to know what they're getting with JD Vance, they can just look to Donald Trump, and that is kind of what they're getting. And I think that's going to be the same thing when Trump gets up there and speaks tonight. You're going to hear a lot of those same points. Vance, though, really didn't stick to the script when it came to all these calls that we've been hearing from the GOP since Saturday for more unity, a lot of hammering of Biden, a lot of hammering of the Democratic administration, and blame for some of the country's issues, especially the crisis at the border and the economy. And so I'm interested, and we know that Trump had kind of retouched and scrapped his old speech for this new and updated one that he's going to give tonight. So I'd be interested to hear tonight if there's going to be that tone of unity that was really lacking from Vance's address last night as well. Yeah,
Doug, what's interesting is that this convention, well, there's an old sort of saying, I even teach this to other journalists, try to get your story down to 3 words. Describe your story in 3 words, and if you can, it'd be even better if you could describe your story in 1 word. Same thing goes politically with a convention. Can you describe this in 3 words? Well, I can tell you it's immigration, crime, but that's under a single banner of the word safety. It seems to be the consistent messaging over multiple days now at the convention is, we're the party of the future and we're here to protect you. So the word is safety, and then underneath that are the issues of crime and immigration. Contrast that, we have no idea what's going to be at the Democratic convention. We don't even know for sure who the nominee is going to be yet. But all the talk of the Biden campaign thus far has been running on, no, really the economy's doing much better than you feel it is, and inflation is dropping and that kind of thing. Do you see this contrast, or are you feeling this message, and do you think it's been effective? I mean, obviously you've got a captive audience there. They're preaching to the choir, but do you get a sense that they're getting some traction with it?
Yeah, I talked to my dad on the phone a little while ago, and he was saying the same thing that I was saying, that a lot of the people in his circle are talking about, even if they're not necessarily GOP voters, how effective some of this messaging has actually been, even to people outside of the base that are here in this building. Safety certainly has been the main focal point of this convention. It's really painting a bleak picture of America as it is right now, and trying to paint a better picture and a much safer picture of an America under a Trump-Vance administration. Just for example, there was all this uproar about this national abortion ban being left out of the platform. I haven't heard the word abortion here one single time off the stage. No one's really talking about that. Really, what everyone's talking about here is immigration, crime, and the economy, and those are all things that play into that wealth and safety themes that we've had. Of course, the first day the theme was wealth, the second day the theme was safety, yesterday the theme was strength. It was very similar messaging that we heard across all 3 of those days and all 3 of those themes here at the RNC. And so, this really is an appeal to Americans to say, look, if you want to be safer, if you want to be more prosperous, then you need to vote for this Trump administration. I think that when we get to the DNC, you're going to hear a little bit more analytics. You're going to hear a little bit more on the data side of, like you said, saying, hey, things aren't as bad as they're painting them. This is a little bit of fear-mongering going on. It's almost like the Democrats are going to be having to be on defense on top of all the other issues that they're going to have to work out there in Chicago. But certainly, there was also this really effective approach that they took to all this messaging through Vance, who, if you want me to sum it up in 3 words, exactly why Vance is here, I think the 3 words are hometown boy. That is exactly what he played to yesterday. He's this really downtrodden kid from Middletown, Ohio, who grew up with a family that had a lot of drug problems. His mom was here sitting in the gallery next to Trump last night. She is 10 years sober. And so he was really playing to a lot of that red meat Republican base who can probably draw some similarities between themselves and Vance. And I mean, think about this. The difference between Vance and Trump and their upbringings and their lifestyles up until a certain point could not be more different. They foil each other almost completely in their backgrounds. And so, we were talking to some delegates yesterday, and they were saying, this is a ticket that represents a lot of Americans up and down the board. And so I think that the whole the whole approach, I should say, to the messaging here at the RNC so far has been, hey, we know you, we know the problems, and we're here to help. And for a lot of people here, it seems to be an effective manner of doing that. Certainly the delegates were happy with the choice of Vance, and they've been very happy with what they've heard here so far. So, like I said, I think Democrats are going to kind of be having to be on defense when they get to Chicago in just a few weeks.
What's interesting, Doug, is that, JD Vance, while all of those things are true, also, went to Yale Law, to his credit. But, there isn't a lot of talk about, they talk about elitists, and then a lot of these folks went to Harvard Law, Yale Law, and that kind of thing. Hey, look, I grew up about 3 miles from Yale Law School, so, I was a townie. So you got a full disclosure kind of on my opinion there. But, to his credit, he pulled himself up by his bootstraps and, served as a Marine, then obviously went to Yale Law. I did want to bring up one other point before we let you go, and that is, for only the second time in U.S. history, we have a president running for a second term that isn't consecutive. And the first time in our modern history. And do you think it gives Donald Trump really 2 advantages? One, he does have a record to run on. he does get a little bit of an incumbent bump because he was already president. So he already has proof he's done the job. But then he also gets to say the country is on a terrible path, and he can say, we need to make America great again. And so he has this sort of dual benefit of not having to be blamed for anything that people think is going wrong. He can blame his opponent and at the same time take credit for his own record, seen through a distorted lens of 4 years where a little bit of amnesia has set in about some of the things that may be less palatable.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the case. There's this real glossing over of some of the things that really didn't go well in the Trump administration. You want to know another word I haven't heard here all week is COVID-19. Nobody has said it. Nobody talked about the response. Nobody talked about those years where Trump was in office, those months really where Trump was in office, where things were not going well. And you want to talk about inheriting a bad economy. Joe Biden's not really getting any credit for that here, and it really has been talked about quite a bit. So, in every video that we've seen produced and every speaker that we've heard get up on stage, there's a look ahead to what a Trump America could be like, but then there's that immediate callback to when things were, in their words, rosy in the administration, when the economy actually was doing relatively well, and there is that glossing over of some of these darker days of the Trump administration. Obviously, we know what it is. It's the RNC. This is, kind of a pep rally for the party itself. So I'm not surprised that we're not talking about that. Let's get to Chicago. I'm sure we'll hear about all of that. But, I think to your point, that's exactly what we've heard, right, is this really built-up version of what Trump America was and what Trump America could be, and really not much talk about some of what's gone wrong in that administration. January 6th, no mention of that either, even though a lot of the language here at the convention has been very similar to what we heard in the days and weeks leading up to that really horrific event. And so I think, let's see what Trump says tonight. He said he scrapped his speech already and input one with a little bit more calls for unity in it. Whether or not that's going to be the case, it certainly wasn't last night with Vance's address either. But we'll see. We'll see what happens tonight. Certainly, it's a good chance for Trump to stick to his word and see maybe if he's had a change of mind, a change of heart at all since what happened to him on Saturday.
Yeah, the only mention of COVID-19 is that Joe Biden has it right now. Obviously very different than when Donald Trump had it. But, people talk about how gas prices were so incredibly low back in, 4 years ago. Well, that's because no one was driving. I mean, the whole globe had stopped driving because everybody was on lockdown. And people seem to forget that when gas prices are low, it means there's lower demand, and that usually means a poor economy. But, like you said, 4 years, you're going to get a little bit of some amnesia. I do have some very good news for you, Doug. You've been working around the clock, and you've been doing yeoman's work. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. But I do have great news for you. After tonight, you can come home. So you can come home tomorrow. We're going to get you a couple of days off, get you rested. But we do need you to work through about 12:30 tonight and go through about a couple more hour-long security lines.
I'll survive. I'm going to have a couple Miller Lights when things wrap up here tonight.
Well deserved. Well deserved. Thank you so much. Doug Reardon reporting live from the convention in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention. So before we go back to Ben Taylor, just wrapping up, as you can see here, this is day 4 of the Republican National Convention. You can see there's a little bit more activity than there was yesterday. Typically, although Donald Trump already did this once, the nominee comes out usually around now to mid-afternoon, and does a walkthrough. It's so that when you walk out on the stage, you're familiar with the lights, where the teleprompter is. I can tell you not only do you have those 2 little reflective pieces of glass that reflect the teleprompter monitor on the floor on to the left and right of the speaker, but also there's one in the back of the room. So looking at this shot right now, if you were standing on that stage, to screen left, there's essentially a large television screen that is directly in the eye line of the speaker, and that has a massive, it has the text of the speech on it. So that should be very effective for, for Donald Trump to be able to see. And then there's a question over whether, does he still wear the bandage tonight? Does he have to? It's been quite the souvenir or accessory that a lot of people at the Republican National Convention delegates have been wearing. They've, in solidarity with their former president and their nominee who survived an assassination attempt, they're wearing, a bandage on the same ear. And it'll be interesting to see whether, at this point, he's wearing it as a badge of honor. It's like, hey, look, I survived. They tried to take me out. It's only an anecdote, but it was going around social media that Donald Trump played golf last Sunday. We don't know if it's true. But again, it's an anecdote going around social media that he sank a 20-foot putt and then said, unlike the shooter, I don't miss. That was quoted by a couple of people secondhand. So whether or not it's true, it's now part of the legend. And so I want to bring in Ben Taylor, again, our political science professor from Kennesaw State University. Ben, I do want to talk about the iconography, like that photograph, an anecdote like I just shared, which, again, in politics, it doesn't have to be true to have an effect. Has this sort of become something of a, nobody wants to go through an assassination attempt, but to survive one is political gold to a degree, isn't it?
Well, what we know from political science about voters and about the way people interpret political information and the way campaigns have any effect at all is through what we'll call heuristics, right? These are cognitive shortcuts that people use because people are busy. They're buying gas, they're going to work, they're taking their kids to soccer, they're feeding the dog, they're going for a walk, they're trying to watch their favorite shows, or they're trying to watch Atlanta News First at 6 p.m. And so they're very busy. They don't have time to learn everything. And so they use clips on the television or things they see on social media or just bits and pieces of information to piece together a worldview. And so powerful images, like the ones you're referencing for former President Trump, or moments during the convention where important phrases are uttered over and over and over again, all of that stuff matters to create a worldview or a position or a frame for a candidate or a campaign, and that becomes the dominant understanding in people's minds about a campaign or about a candidate. And so to the extent that that image is being recycled over and over and over again and being shown on nightly news broadcasts and through social media posts, yes, it's going to be very important. But how will its importance affect people's votes in November? We really don't know. We really can't know until election day. But those kinds of images, the kind of constant refrains you've been talking about all day, we've been talking about the RNC, those kinds of important framing messages are really, really important to create this heuristic understanding for voters, whether they're partisan Republicans or these crucial independents who are going to be making the decisions to vote between the candidates in November, who are actually going to decide the election in all likelihood.
And speaking more broadly, isn't it more powerful for a voter, when you're standing there deciding, if you haven't decided already, which it's been covered ad nauseum, right, that there's very little, of the electorate that is switchable. But when you get in there and you're making that choice, or you're making the choice in advance, isn't it often based on how you feel rather than what you know?
Absolutely. Voting is a very emotional, sort of emotional experience for a lot of people. That's why you don't see Republicans move away from their Republican candidates or Democrats, right? Again, that's the whole problem for the Democratic Party right now, is that the party institution has not coalesced around Joe Biden, or they've moved away from him in some sense. And so that's what's causing the consternation. Once you see that institution make a decision, you'll see Democrats in public opinion polls, and when it comes to voting, come home. They're going to vote for the Democrat. And so it's a very emotional attachment that they have to their party. And the same thing is true for independents. Even though they don't have that emotional attachment to the party itself, they develop an emotional attachment to the candidates. And so to the extent your candidate is able to develop that sort of positive emotional response or elicit a negative response to the opposing candidate, that's what those independent voters and moderate voters are going to be voting about.
One last question I want to ask you, Ben, before we thank you for giving us so much time today. Yeah. I hope I get at least a few credit hours for this toward my master's. Sure. But I did want to ask you about, at this point, and this is not my opinion, it's an analysis based on the polls, this is Donald Trump's election to lose, at least at this snapshot in time. What could Donald Trump do tonight to lose, essentially hurt his case, and what could he do to win it? Should he play safe, or should he swing for the fences?
Well, we have to remember that this is the third time that Donald J. Trump has run for president, and he has yet to win the popular vote. So he's extremely popular among Republicans. If he gives a speech tonight that is aimed at blowing the roof off of the auditorium in Milwaukee, then it's going to be really great among Republicans, but it may turn off a lot of independent voters. So that is going to be something he needs to watch out for. So if you are in his current position, based on polling data that we have, my advice, if I was going to give advice to a candidate, would be, hey, give a down-the-middle speech. Don't make anyone mad. You might not make, your most diehard partisans excited, but they're excited for you already. You don't have to win them over. They've already won. That's the strategy you would use in that context. But I don't know President Trump personally, but just having watched him over the last decade, that doesn't seem to be his style. So I would not be surprised to see him go for that base, red meat speech a la 2016 and 2020. But, again, given this current position, if an election were held today, the safe play is to attract moderate voters, attract independent voters, or at least don't turn them off. And that's really the open question we have until we hear his speech tonight.
Absolutely. Ben Taylor, your analysis is always so spot on and so helpful, and more importantly, not partisan. So, we may be the only two nonpartisans left in the world among my fellow journalists as well. So it's great to have you. Thank you so much. We hope to welcome you back here on our future live streams covering. But boy, we have quite a year. If the last 3.5 weeks have been any indication, this is going to be an election year to remember. Thanks again, Ben Taylor.
Thanks for having me.
Kennesaw State University. So now we want to take sort of a moment to reset. Where have we been? Where are we going? Where have we been is that we have had 3 nights of the convention. We've had multiple speakers. What we have seen is unity. Not unity between Democrats and Republicans, but unity within the Republican Party itself. And so you have seen all of the people who were opposing Donald Trump come into his corner. They didn't just show up. They unabashedly supported him and said, including Nikki Haley, who had competed against him to the very bitter end, said, nope, I'm now saying all the people who voted for me should vote for Donald Trump because the alternative, we don't even know what it's going to be. And if we do, even with all the options, we don't want it to be that person. So you have this unity within the Republican Party, a nearly flawless convention up to this point. And then you have President Biden currently sidelined, canceling all of his political appearances because he has COVID-19. And of course that's appropriate, but at the same time you have Donald Trump, who has just survived an assassination attempt. Within days he's going to be accepting the nomination, having literally survived by inches a .556 bullet from an AR-style rifle that appears to have clipped his ear. And so these are the two things that are happening sort of in split screen at the same moment. What's next is you're going to see Donald Trump take the stage, as we mentioned, and it's an open question of which Donald Trump's going to show up, but you can guarantee that it will not be quiet and it will not be without hyperbole, because that's his style. And at the end of the day, he's a showman, and center stage is where he wants to be. It's where he's always wanted to be, and that's where he will be tonight. So let's take a look at this CBS News story that sort of sets up where we are in the race and where we're going. And on the back end, we'll talk to Joy Lim Nakrin.
I was just on the phone with President Biden, and he shared his deep disappointment at not being able to join us this afternoon. The president has been at many events, as we all know, and he just tested positive for COVID.
The diagnosis forced President Biden to bow out of his appearance before Latino voters in Las Vegas late Wednesday afternoon. He made the trip west to reassure them he is the only man to lead the country. Biden captured a majority of Hispanic voters in 2020, but their support has been declining. A new Associated Press Nork Center for Public Affairs research poll reveals 2/3 of Democrats say the president should exit the race, with only about 3 in 10 feeling extremely or very confident Biden has the mental capacity to serve effectively as president. Just today, Representative Adam Schiff became the latest high-profile Democrat to urge Biden to pass the baton, saying, quote, "I have serious concerns about whether the president can defeat Donald Trump in November." During an exclusive interview with BET, Mr. Biden reiterated his plan to stay in the race.
The only thing age brings a little bit of wisdom, and I think I've demonstrated that I know how to get things done for the country. But there's more to do, and I'm reluctant to walk away from that.
As more congressional Democrats call for President Biden to exit the race, the White House points out he still enjoys support from key allies, such as the chairman of the Congressional Black and Hispanic Caucuses, along with prominent Democratic governors and mayors. Skyler Henry, CBS News, the White House.
There is a lot still up in the air, and some of that are the criminal cases that are currently pending against the former President of the United States, now the Republican nominee. Joining me is Joy Lim-Nakrin, not only our great streaming reporter here and anchor at Atlanta News First Plus, but also a member of the bar, an attorney. So her viewpoints on the law, come with the backing of a Juris Doctor. So it's so good to have you here, Joy.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I appreciate being here with you.
So today we're talking about the 11th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals here in Atlanta. It covers Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, so this could happen in any one of those three states. But essentially right now we have Jack Smith, who is the special prosecutor who was appointed by the Attorney General, who was Judge Cannon down in Florida said with this Mar-a-Lago documents case, he was appointed unconstitutionally because he was not confirmed by Congress, which is a fairly novel political argument, or legal argument,
Right.
I should say. But now Jack Smith himself, who, according to Judge Cannon, shouldn't even exist, is now appealing that decision to the 11th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. So tell me about how that process works and how likely he is to prevail.
Yeah, so, and just kind of, making sure that our viewers are kind of following along, because again, we've got now 4 different criminal cases against the former president. The one that we're talking about right now is the federal, essentially mishandling classified documents case led by the special prosecutor, Jack Smith. And, this centers around really what Mr. Trump allegedly did at his Mar-a-Lago resort, mainly, allegedly hoarding documents, classified documents, allegedly impeding FBI's access to them. But what happened on Monday, just kind of laying kind of the groundwork for people who may be a little bit lost, because it frankly has been kind of mind-blowing, all of the twists and turns that we've been seeing in the legal realm concerning the former president. But on Monday we saw that Judge Eileen Cannon, a federal judge on the 11th Circuit, dismissed that whole case against former president. And like you said, the reason she did so is she found that it was unconstitutional for Jack Smith to be acting as the special prosecutor in this case, because she said essentially, he wasn't appointed by the president, he wasn't confirmed by Congress. But that's something that, there's obviously some pushback about, which is why now we have an appeal by Jack Smith himself, the special prosecutor, appointed to the case, which is something that I think we foresaw. We foresaw also the possibility that the DOJ, as a larger body, could have launched the appeal. But we see that Jack Smith has done that. And what is also interesting for us being here in Atlanta is that the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals is based here in Atlanta. It has offices down in Florida, in 2 Florida locations, I believe Jacksonville and Miami, and also in Montgomery, Alabama, because as you mentioned, the 11th Circuit is essentially these 3 states. So that's something else that we're watching for. What we're learning from kind of our go-to legal analysts who we keep as sources here on Atlanta News First is that it is very likely that the case would be heard here in Atlanta, but of course possible in Florida, since the underlying case with the lower court was in Florida. And the alleged acts have primarily been taking place in Florida. But, it's interesting. I mean, we're obviously going to see a lot of back and forth, and that's what Mr. Trump's various legal teams have done very well, is sort of fighting back and creating opportunities for the former president to succeed, and also creating delays, which are an impediment to the legal process for a number of reasons. I mean, one, it's frankly just annoying for prosecutors, right, to have to deal with, more paperwork, more filings, and push back again. But also, something that's very important in criminal cases is testimony. And memories fade over time. So generally what we see is that the further out it gets, the more difficult it is to get witnesses to testify. Also, witnesses move away, witnesses pass away, witnesses get sick, all kinds of things happen with witnesses. And so, that's a real challenge.
I mean, and delay is, I should say, a regular, if not appropriate, tactic for any defense team, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Delay, delay, delay. We hear that all the time from our criminal defense attorneys who, again, we use as regular sources here. Because it is, frankly, it's downright annoying for prosecutors.
Yeah, but in this case, what you have is there is actually a clock running, and the clock that has nothing to do with the
That's
courts. There's a political clock running, And if Donald Trump is elected, and then is he will then go to an inauguration in January. The moment he becomes president of the United States, he can, and likely would, tell his attorney general and his Justice Department to dismiss the case, to basically drop the case.
No, and that's an excellent point. That is an excellent point. And the other thing, as we're talking about the clock, not just the that possibility that you laid out of greater power as president, potentially to be able to fight this, but also just the clock, essentially. In terms of getting reelected, right? That's the goal is for Mr. Trump is to get reelected, and if he can sort of push things back further and further past November, that's obviously a positive thing for him because he just wants to focus on that goal for the moment, it seems.
Yeah, it's really interesting because these federal cases he can dismiss. He can even pardon himself. And by the way, it was sort of this academic discussion when he was president. Could the president pardon himself?
Yeah.
The pardon power in the Constitution is absolute. There's no limits on it. It merely says that the president can pardon whomever the president wants for federal charges. It doesn't say the president can't pardon himself. And what's interesting is because of the Supreme Court decision ruling that a president taking an official act, even if illegal, even if corrupt, even if it has mens rea, criminal intent, doesn't matter. You can't prosecute him in office. You can't prosecute him after he leaves office if he commits this official act. And they put no limits on that. The official act, as long as it's within the outer bounds of the president's official acts, that it's completely legal. So the president could corruptly, whoever the president is going forward, the president could corruptly order. And imagine if, by the way, if Richard Nixon knew this, because this wasn't even a outside possibility amongst his attorneys. Imagine, if Haldeman and John Dean and all these others knew that Nixon could go to the Supreme Court and say, hey, I'm immune from all criminal prosecution even after I leave office. That wasn't even a possibility. That's why Gerald Ford pardoned him. You don't have to pardon a former president for criminal charges if they're immune. Well, now the law of the land, because of this new Supreme Court decision, is a president could corruptly tell the Justice Department to back off of him or his co-conspirators or alleged co-conspirators. And the same thing with the, pardoning himself. But he can't do that with state charges, and that makes the Fani Willis case sort of front and center. And we're not going to even hear an appeal on whether Fani Willis can still be the prosecutor until December 5th?
That's right, December 5th.
After the election and before the inauguration.
That's right. And initially we thought that would take place in October. Well, that was kind of the speculation that it would take place in October. And I believe that date was actually listed by the courts. But at any rate, it's been pushed back to December. So, the delay tactic seems to be working.
It's just fascinating. It's fascinating. So the thing is, I think it's important to point out that we are not going to see any kind of trial. We've had one. He's been convicted of Donald Trump's been convicted of multiple felonies and will be sentenced before the election.
In September.
That's right, but just before the election, unless something changes, because that was scheduled for last week,
Yes.
and it was moved to September after the Supreme Court decision. But, in your view, we're not going to see any kind of additional criminal trials before the election, correct?
I don't think it's realistic, and there are greater minds than myself, greater legal minds than myself that, I look to also for guidance, and it doesn't seem realistic. And what we see, if there's anything that Mr. Trump's various legal teams, and he has various legal teams because he's got, 4 different criminal fights that he's fighting in different jurisdictions. If there's one thing that they're good at, it's fighting back and creating these delays, creating these opportunities for their client, Mr. Trump, to succeed. And really, right now, his goal is to succeed in the presidential election.
Absolutely. Joy Lim Nakrin, thanks for joining us as always. Thanks for actually letting me sit in your spot or stand in your spot where you're normally presenting all this information.
Hey, you're the political guru.
I'm not a political guru. I just play one on TV
Well, hey,
or on
you had me
streaming.
fooled.
Well, thanks so much, Joy, for joining us. And thank all of you for joining us and giving us your time. We've been on for the last hour with excellent guests, including Ben Taylor from Kennesaw State University. We're going to be back tomorrow with another live stream at 11 to wrap all of this up. To wrap up the convention and look ahead to the Democratic National Convention. We're now just seconds away from the noon report, which you'll see on both on Atlanta News First Plus and on Atlanta News First, a live local newscast. And then also we do have these specials here. At 9 o'clock, we've got a streaming special, and then at 10 o'clock, we're on Atlanta News First. I'll be back at 7 o'clock tonight on the air, on television, to talk about what's going on at the convention and anything to do with the investigation into the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. For now, I'm Brendan Keefe, Chief Investigator, Atlanta News First Investigates. See you next time.